Hello, hello, my dispatchers, my listeners. I'm your author, your narrator, your host, Scipio Eruditus. And today I have the honor of being joined by Michael Hoffman II, a prolific author, writer, substacker. You can catch his work at revisionisthistory.org. And of course, he writes at Revelation of the Method on Substack. He's the author of numerous books, as I mentioned, Judaism's Strange Gods, Usury and Christendom, the Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, and a subject we're going to be talking about quite a bit today, secret societies and psychological warfare. And so Michael Hoffman is someone I considered truly a luminary in this field of parapolitical research and occult research. His work is something that I've cited quite frequently in my works, whether it be on Judaism or occult psychodramas and Revelation of the Method, the coincidence zone, as I dub it, in my writings. And so very honored to be joined by Mr. Hoffman here. I guess, introduce yourself to the audience, please, sir.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I live in North Idaho, surrounded by a lot of preppers and some infrastructure, not as much as I had back east, but there's some great libraries here and research opportunities, and it's a wonderful place to raise a family and also to be inhabiting as I am at the present time.
Certainly, good to hear it. And now, as far as your interest in these subjects, I know you were a writer for the Associated Press for some time. Now, what got you interested, I guess, in writing in general, and then even more specifically? I mean, this is quite a niche field, right, of occult and parapolitical research.
Well, I've been writing since I was about 5 or 6 years old. My mother was very literate. She was a Latin scholar, and she would read to me from Edgar Allan Poe when I was 4. And I just started picking up a pen at about 6 or 7 and writing short stories and things like that, and being much attracted to books. As far as the rest of my proclivities and aptitudes and interests, it's largely been a process of serendipity because of so many of the people that I happened to meet along life's way that I wasn't intentionally seeking out, but that were presented to me. Everyone from Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame, who lived down the road not too far from where I was. And of course, the Twilight Zone itself had a big impact on me as a kid in the early 60s growing up because he placed many of the flying saucer crashes or the witchcraft scenes or whatever in my neighborhood because he was a native of upstate New York, which is where I hail from. And so here you are, 8 or 9 years old, and you're watching shows about things happening 5 miles down the road or 10 miles down the road. So that certainly kindled my imagination. And then later on, I became interested in the philosopher Charles Fort, who wrote a series, a tetralogy, 4 books on strange anomaly for which the yardstick of science doesn't account. And that had an enormous influence on me. I ended up as a columnist for 40 Times before it became a glossy magazine. It was more or less an enthusiast periodical where we could explore these subjects without a great deal of political correctness. And then later on, some kind of deal was cut with some corporation, and it became one of those areas were off limits. And I thought that much of the radical aspects of Charles Fort's expansive worldview had been diminished and domesticated by the demands of the corporate world. So I moved on from there. And yes, eventually I was a reporter for the New York Bureau of the Associated Press. And then later on, I went on to work for the Institute for Historical Review and then began writing my books on a whole range of subjects, which the library angel has presented to me. That I just stumble over some of these recondite facts and then try to make sense out of them and present them to my readers. So that's sort of been my journey so far.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, I share certainly share a lot of those same kind of fascinations. As far as our topic today, right? When did you first know that the government was lying to you, or did you grow up kind of always being taught this?
No, I don't know what particular point there was. I grew up in the ferment of the new age, you could call it. In fact, I have a little statement here. If you don't mind me just giving a little bit of a
Yeah,
disquisition.
certainly.
So, someone was asking me about the onset of the Beatles and whether or not that was a degenerate phenomenon. And this was asked on Substack. It's in the comments section of my column. And I replied by saying that President Kennedy was murdered in November 1963. And at that time, the soul of America was wounded in the wake of this killing of the King of Camelot, as my mentor, James Shelby Downard, called it years later when I ran into him. And it was a disconsolate Christmas that year, and the nation was no better off in the new year until February 1964, when a mop-topped English quartet debuted on national television singing I Want to Hold Your Hand. And America's young people grasped the hand that was offered to them in an anguished desire for healing and solace. And it was the beginning of the change of era time. So when I saw, even as a kid, I was 10 or 11 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated. I felt in my intuition that this was much more than one lone assassin and one very talented rifle bullet. And that was just an intuition. I had no other research to go on. I remember at the time telling one of my best friends that maybe the communists had done it. But so I certainly didn't have all my T's crossed and my I's dotted, but that was something that was speaking to me in my heart. And so, with this change of era time, as it proceeded onward into the Vietnam War and the rest of the startling phenomena, we were witnessing the remarkable essence of one epoch departing and another arriving before our eyes, the turning of the wheel of time, so to speak, set into motion by the alchemy that was attendant upon the ritual death of Camelot's king, who was replaced by his usurper, Macbeth. Now, of course, President Kennedy's administration was referred to by the establishment media as Camelot, meaning that it was a dreamlike, beautiful episode in American politics, which basically departed from the usual backroom type of politics and was something higher and better. And I think to a certain degree, President Kennedy did indeed represent that. But then we have this notion of Macbeth, the killer of the king. Lyndon Johnson, who we now, I think current research has established that he was one of the conspirators in the assassination of President Kennedy. Well,
Unquestionably.
way back then in the 60s, Lyndon Johnson was styled by Barbara Garson in the twilight language of the day as Macbird. And Garson had a play of that same name, which debuted almost exactly 3 years after the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. So her play debuted in February 1967. And she portrayed JFK as the slain King Ken O'Dunk, which is wordplay on King Duncan from Shakespeare's play Macbeth. He's the king who's killed. So she's making direct links here. And in her theatrical, Lyndon Baines Johnson is the homicidal striver Macbird, in other words, Macbeth. And Lady Bird Johnson is shown to be Lady Macbird or Lady Macbeth. So according to
Hmm.
James Shelby Downard, some of the planning for the JFK assassination took place in the ghost town of Shakespeare, New Mexico, which is 80 miles west of the Three Sisters or Tres Hermanas Mountains, recalling the three weird sisters, also known as witches, in Macbeth. So this isn't just handwriting on the wall, Scipio. It's handwriting on an enchanted landscape with a pen dipped in the ink of psychogeography, what Mr. Downard termed mystical toponymy. And he and I then collaborated on a manuscript called King Kill 33, which takes up these topics. So in Pharaonic Egypt, and this Egypt is really behind Babylon, further back than Babylon, Egypt is really the fount of black magic, sorcery in the world today. Almost all the Western secret societies of the left-hand path refer back to Egypt as their source. And in Pharaonic Egypt, the cosmic graveyard was located in the desert west, overseen by blackjack. And blackjack is a theme both in my book, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, as well as Twilight Language, tied into the number 21. And so blackjack is Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer, and the autotarch of ceremonial autopsies in ancient Egypt. Now, look at the parallels with the American desert Southwest. It's home to many Thanatos, in other words, death connections, among them Death Valley, where Frank Norris, in his important novel McTeague, portrayed the destiny of the archetypal American white person as handcuffed to a dead man, and of the Trinity site, where atomic fire, the shatterer of worlds, was first invoked at the terminus of the old Mexican road known as the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. America is a house which has been haunted by evil spirits for many a moon. And I'll conclude by saying this of doubters, I ask, with the late Fortean philosopher John Michel, who do you think has been mutilating livestock out west for decades with surgical precision, leaving no trail of any kind? That has to be evil spirits. It can't be connected to anything that we know materially thus far. Now, I'm certainly open to correction, but that's some of the evidence that I present for this particular case and some of the groundwork from which I begin with, because, as a kid, watching a president of the United States killed in broad daylight at high noon, and then as I got older and watched the Warren Commission, many of his own enemies appointed to that commission, including Alan Dulles, who he had fired from the CIA. And it wasn't too hard to begin making connections in terms of an evil that was behind the scene flats of what's presented to us as history.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, man, so many places we could jump off from. So, I guess before we get too much more into it, explain your concept of twilight language and why this is such an important, an important concept when understanding really the driving spiritual forces behind so many of the headlines that we see on a day-to-day basis.
Well, it's tied into revelation of the method, which we can talk about later as well. But what it really is it's a way of speaking to the subconscious, not the unconscious. The unconscious is when we're asleep, and you can talk to that to a certain degree, but to the subconscious when we are awake. And it's talking over our waking minds, directing us into what Dr. Carl Gustav Jung called archetypes. Archetypes which stayed with us through a transmission process along with our DNA, however you want to describe it. And I wouldn't know what the mental, metaphysical, or physiological aspects of that might be. This was his conjecture, but
Hmm.
I think that it works because it's been in practice by the occult and even by highly sophisticated Manhattan advertising agencies to get us to buy their products. When I was at Hobart College as a student, Dr. Wilson Bryan Key came with a fascinating slideshow showing the subliminals in whiskey ads and various types of Madison Avenue sloganeering and advertisements. And so people's eyes were being opened as early as that, which was, I believe, the late 1960s. But so what we have is the speaking to the subconscious using words which are freighted with these subliminals and these code words. And one of them, as I was reporting, for example, on the Son of Sam killings in the 1970s, and I noticed that the alleged Berkowitz, and it wasn't Berkowitz who was sending the cryptic letters to Jimmy Breslin, it was other members of the Son of Sam cult. And the letter was signed Wicked King Wicker, rapist and murderer of young girls. And now, no one in the Son of Sam killings had been raped, and no young girls had been murdered. They were all, unless you want to call a teenager, but usually young girls would be somebody prepubescent. And so that started to put me on the trail of this word wicker, which relates back to the Wicker Man. And there's a famous movie of that set on
A
I
couple
believe,
of them, yeah.
Scottish island. Well, the earliest one is the best one, in my opinion. But and then, of course, we have Burning Man out in the desert, which is a wicker type figure, even though it isn't made out of wicker. And my colleague Jim Keith, research colleague, who wrote an important book, Secret and Suppressed, died out there at the Wicker Man celebration there. He actually was mortally wounded and then died at the hospital.
Hmm.
But so this sacrificial aspect, now Berkowitz is supposed to be an unlettered thug of a killer, a behemoth, and yet here he is using these literary allusions, Wicked King Wicker, which I later tied into the Hillside Strangler and a much larger cult than this. I was working for a while with Maury Terry, who did some of this research. And then later on,
Yes.
Maury went off the rails with his Manson 2 theories and stuff like that. But he's a good guy. A lot of this conspiracy research involves a psychic an opening of your own psyche to these forces, and you have to be very careful that you yourself are not dislocated by that opening. And I have certainly prayed about this and consulted spiritual counselors and advisors about how far I should go. And thus far, by the grace of God and my Lord Jesus Christ, I've been able to continue without a whole lot of psychic baggage connected to me. But it definitely is something that goes along with the peril of this type of a task. And I think Maury was vulnerable to that. But anyhow, so that's one example. And another one is Willard, where you see some of the, I mean, anyone, the thing about Charles Ford is there was no expertise. In Fordian studies, no one's an expert. Anyone can get into this and follow up what they feel is important. And then whether or not they can attract an audience is another thing. So for me, tracking Willard, when I saw how much was connected to Willard, for example, the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., a center of conspiracies through time. The last place before Abraham Lincoln went to give his inaugural speech, that's where he was lodged. Trump, many of the things connected with Trump and his administration were devised and designed at the Willard Hotel. There's Willard State Hospital in upstate New York. Many of the psychiatric facilities, at least in the days when they ran them, most psychiatric people are now dumped out on the streets and create the homeless situation as a result of this group home concept that they foisted on the taxpayers, saying that it would save them more money. Well, we've spent billions on homeless, mentally ill people. But in prior times, these areas were considered recruiting areas for the occult because some people who have very powerful minds and just don't fit into the dog eat dog American capitalist society are then flung into these more or less salvage operations or garbage dumps for human beings. Although Willard State Hospital actually offered asylum, it was called an asylum. And that's a good word
Hmm.
for it, offered asylum to these people. I discussed this at length because I worked at Willard State Hospital, at that time known as Willard Psychiatric. We had about 1,500 patients. I was working my way through college at the time. And so in general, asylum is provided to those who could be harmed by society or those who might harm society, but also a recruiting effort, certain psychiatrists or maybe personnel. I was just a lowly nurse's aide there at the time, but I certainly saw lots of things that I disagreed with, especially the electroshock therapy that was administered, sometimes needlessly and recklessly. But anyway, Willard has these connections. What is Mitt Romney's real first name? Willard Mitt Romney. And so, I mean, is that something conclusive? No. What I'm trying to do is point out that there are hundreds of these threads which you have to weave together to create the carpet of Twilight language. But I noticed that in serial murders, for example, not just with Son of Sam, in The Silence of the Lambs, much is made about a wicker scene. There's too much emphasis being placed on this wicker for it to be accidental. And so I'm trying to remind the American people of the level of manipulation that's going on that would prepare them for the next stage in what I call an alchemical process, because this isn't just turning lead into gold, as we're told, what alchemy, a precursor to modern medicine and things like that. It's actually human alchemy. And that's what the Rosicrucians were about as early as the 17th century. And from there, if you look at the alchemical manuscripts, as James Shelby Downer did, he saw something noted there called must be, or the revelation of the method, the making manifest of all that is hidden. And that had to be timed to a certain dissolution of humanity. It couldn't just be put out in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or the 18th century, because many of the conspirators, if they revealed to people what they had done to them, would end up hanging from lampposts that evening because the people were very vibrant and robust in terms of their humanity and in recognizing who their enemies were and then punishing them. Whereas now, after we have gone through this processing, whether it's through Twilight language or many of the other forms of indoctrination and brainwashing that the American people and others in the West have been subjected to, we've reached the point where we're not fully human anymore, in my opinion. Now, I'm not a gloom and doom guy. I believe in a lot of hope. My wife and I have raised a large family of children. We couldn't have done that without hope. But also, we have to be realistic in terms of what our fellow Americans, where they are in position here. And what's happened consistently, and I haven't seen any end to this, is is that beginning in the 1970s, slowly, and it's reached a crescendo in the 21st century, the people who have victimized us, the people who are the evil, iniquitous wrongdoers here, have displayed to us what they've done to us in many cases. They have let it out, they have revealed it. I mean, 9/11 is obviously a case of controlled demolition of the buildings coming down as a result of explosives planted inside those buildings. It's obvious. You can take a look, for example, at the conversations between air traffic control and the pilots on board the jets. All of those were destroyed by members of the United States government. That's a matter of record. The New York Times reported it. And so that's a type of revelation of the method. Look what we're doing to you. George W. Bush, this supposedly respectable Yale graduate, a scion of an eminent family. Actually, there's nothing eminent about these crooks and scoundrels and assassins, but that's what we're told.
Eminent and evil only.
Yeah. And so George W. Bush and these other people, they're not wearing swastika armbands. They're not looking like gangsters. They're wearing executive habiliments, the clothing of the executive class, and they largely speak in mild tones. They don't rant and rave. And yet at the same time, they're capable of killing thousands of their own Americans in order to get the war in Iraq started and to take Americans to the next level of alchemical dissolution. And so, that's basically where we are at in terms of being told about the evil that's done to us. And we sit here stunned and we don't react. We don't really react. Now, the Make America Great Again movement is certainly a nascent type of almost like an infant trying to grab for that milk bottle. It is a sort of an attempt from the very core of our being to try once again to restore and renew America, but it's been sidetracked, it has been perverted, it's been made into a joke by Trump and others around them. I have belief in people like Thomas Massey and Rand Paul, maybe even Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's a few voices out there who are trying to point out what's going on, but at the same time, still, these revelations are made to us. The Epstein case is one of them. Had Massey and Ro Khanna on the Democrat side not pushed through this law saying that all Epstein files had to be revealed and divulged, we would still be back at square one, where Dan Bongino, who was a conspiracy theorist when he had a podcast and then seemed to have lost most of that when he was assistant director of the FBI. What does that tell us? Okay. There they are, on the one hand saying you've been shafted by the government. Then when they're in the government, they say there's nothing to see here. That's revelation of the method. That's people who are actually identifying themselves as traitors to the American people. And what do we do about it? I mean, I'm not calling for any harm to be done to Dan Bongino, God forbid. But what are we doing about it in terms of saying, look, now we need to have a reform of MAGA because it's gone off the rails. And I think people don't realize that the process of reform and renewal is ongoing and constant. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, whereas so many of us, I remember when Ronald Reagan got elected, and this might seem naive now, but it wasn't in 1980. When he was elected, many conservatives and people who wanted to restore America went to sleep. They said, the battle's been won. We have our man in the presidency. And actually it wasn't. And I think Reagan was also a bad guy. However he started out or whatever, bad guy who did some good things, but that's where we are now. So yes, this is one of my fundamental issues here, is presenting to people the need to turn off the videos in terms of, like when I'm on the internet and I have people 9 times out of 10, when they want to refer me to something, it's to a video. And I can't understand what's happened to texts, because so much more information is contained in a book or a text. In a half hour, I can go through thousands of words, whereas in a video, I can't. Now, I know one picture is worth 10,000 words, but is it a case of pictures, or is it a case of a kind of, and there are some, wonderful documentaries and movies. But what I'm saying is that when the primary orientation is away from the printed page, which requires concentration and introspection, and which also typically, if it's a good text, ennobles us and tests our powers of analysis, and we're more in the visual, which Guy Debord called in his wonderful book, The Society of the Spectacle, in that eponymous book. And so we have been overwhelmed by all of these images, and sometimes you have a class of conspiracy theorists, and I'd say 80 or 90% of conspiracy theorists are in this class, where they're in it more for adrenaline thrills than they are for trying to bring to justice by jury trials before a trial of their peers and prosecution these conspirators. Jim Garrison is the only one I know with the national level of conspiracies who tried to do that with David Shaw and Ferry and Shaw and David Ferry and others to bring them to justice. That should be our goal, and we have to work on that. That requires media, it requires police, and these other things. Whereas if it's just a case of like, well, let's have Hoffman spook us with stories of numbers and twilight language and geomancy. And once that thrill wears off, let's find another guy who can give us another thrill. No, that's worse than useless. And that's why I don't really consider myself part of that community, because I'm concerned about how futile it is and how much the cryptocracy itself is behind something like that.
Yeah, certainly. That's one of the things I've appreciated in your writing is that, in terms of epistemology, you are much more grounded than, it's again, 80% is probably, a fair representation of the conspiracy researchers out there. And this is one of the issues that, and it's the reason why I generally try and stay away from current events. And it's constantly right. There's some new rabbit trail, some new event they want us all distracted and concerned with and fighting about. And meanwhile, the machine rolls on.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, exposing the lies only does so much. And as you have noted, often, after, a set amount of time, that's part of the plan, right? Learned helplessness is a very real mental phenomenon. And I mean, how many generations, how many decades does it take? I think we're certainly living the results of that psychic transformation, and that the most horrific things can be revealed about the government. And this is one of the reasons why I have focused on the Epstein story, but not just, the salacious details, but the implications of the story, right? And the outrage that people should have. I mean, some of the most horrific crimes one can imagine against children, against the innocent, have been perpetrated by the highest levels of our government, our intelligence services, certainly our military as well, and our politicians. And the reaction of it, right, is that many of these same people who claim they want to fight this, before they get into the levers of power, like Dan Bongino, a perfect example. We've called out his bad behavior numerous times, but he was singing a very different tune when he had his podcast, right? I mean, all but admitting, he's saying, he had on good authority that Jeffrey Epstein was affiliated with a certain Middle Eastern, and this is the way he phrased it, right? I wonder what Middle Eastern country that could be, right? Yeah, well, now we know, as his emails and others have been leaked, right? I mean, Jeffrey Epstein was working hand in glove with many of the highest officials of the Israeli government, and not just, the political side, but the intelligence side as well. So this is just, at what point, right? Uh, you know, I'm recalling Isaiah and his words. It's like, where yet would you be struck? It's like, what information could they reveal to you, right? That we will allow and sometimes even facilitate, as we're seeing more and more in the Epstein files here. I mean, there are some horrific stuff. I mean, we've truly only scratched the surface, and even though they keep finding more and more batches of this information, magically, right? I mean, we could be getting Epstein files for the next, 10, 20 years, really, at the rate they keep trickling these things out. And it really is just, you know, you mentioned it earlier, right? It's only been through my faith in Christ that has kept me grounded through so much of this. And despite the evil that we're faced with, allows me to remain hopeful. And I think, the other aspect of that too is just having a proper understanding of history and truly, I think, example, I had a listener, reach out to me, and I brought up this example, right? Imagine you are a Christian living in Spain, and for almost a millennia, there is constant warfare and struggle with the Muslims, right? I mean, truly a bloody affair. I mean, for almost a millennia.
Mhm.
And if you are, a Spaniard, or if you're a Christian, I mean, you cannot ever imagine a time where the Muslim horde is going to be beaten back from the land of Spain, and yet, eventually that would indeed happen.
Mhm.
So I think, one of the downsides of living in America, right, is that our collective memory as a nation, and in terms of social media, certainly making this worse, right? But our collective memories are very short, and so our perspectives are very easy to warp in this manner. Um, and what are some of the other things I wanted to touch
Well,
upon
I
here?
wanted to add about you mentioning,
Certainly.
the FBI and some of the top government officials involved with these child molestations, and we do have to rely on empirical evidence because I think with QAnon and some of the others, they went out into left field there. And again, I see that as the cognitive dissonance that the cryptocracy sows in our ranks in order to have certain people who then get tremendous publicity, even though their accusations are largely groundless, in order to tar the rest of us as being inadequate or reckless researchers. And certainly we have to adhere to the documentary record. But I just did a Substack study on the MI5 and MI6, Margaret Thatcher and Prince Charles' involvement with the Jimmy Savile molestation movement in Great Britain. From the top down, he molested approximately 500 young people over the course of his career. During that time, he was knighted by the Queen of England. He was one of the best friends of Prince Charles, and his crimes were covered up by Margaret Thatcher, who concealed the files that were related to that. Margaret Thatcher, the iconic heroine to American conservatives and allegedly
Yep.
close friend of Ronald Reagan. And so the message here is that you have a situation where anyone who wants to get close to the Queen of England, or at that time, the Prince of Wales, now the King, would be vetted by MI5, the FBI of Great Britain. So it was obvious that they knew what Jimmy Savile was doing. And to what degree they were partnered with him is anyone's guess because we haven't been able to penetrate that far. And what I've tried to do is point out that the Masonic aristocracy, if it has a world headquarters, it's in London, okay? And someone can say Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is beyond Freemasonry. Freemasonry's symbol is of the square and compass, which is an incomplete hexagram, an
Hmm.
incomplete Magen David or Star of David, as it's called, signaling that they are incomplete Talmudists, incomplete Kabbalists, whereas the perfection is done in Jerusalem. But having said that, nonetheless, they were the main force in bringing back the Talmudists to Jerusalem. They're the main force behind the notion of rebuilding the third temple in Jerusalem, and also of the Masonic inheritance, which they originally inherited from the occult Renaissance, which I talk about in my book, which you mentioned, because this doesn't begin with Britain. It begins with the 15th century Catholic Church as it was deteriorating and degenerating under the impetus of the Medici bankers who were bringing in this psychic contagion, which I call Neoplatonic Hermetic Kabbalism. And that began in the 1450s with the funding of the Platonic Academy in Florence, led by Reverend Father Marsilio Ficino, who dug into all of these Greek texts, translated them, brought them to the fore, and then attracted a young votary by the name of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, one of the most important men in the intellectual history of the West, largely unknown to our day. He published something
Indeed.
called the 900 Kabbalistic Theses. And the official establishment story about that is the popes were all against it, and the church was horrified, and he was heavily persecuted. But if you read my book, you will see that that was a cover story, and in fact, he was heavily protected. And the Kabbalistic root then was able to gain firm purchase inside of the church with some very honorable exceptions. And I find that one of the startling conclusions that I reached as a result of my research was much of the Inquisition, both Spanish Inquisition, Italian Inquisition, was, if you look closely at it, directed at the conservative reaction to Pico della Mirandola, the conservative
Mm.
reaction to the Kabbalistic infiltration of the church. It wasn't just that liberals were being burned like Giordano Bruno and others like that. And Bruno was an occultist. Most of these occultists were protected. The only reason he was executed was he rejected papal authority, whereas the other occultists all submitted to the Pope of Rome. Leo X, who was the nemesis of Martin Luther, was a protector both of Johannes Reuchlin, who was the Kabbalist who inherited that mantle from Pico della Mirandola. And also, it said that the Catholic Church burned the Talmud. Okay, well, that's such a generalization that it really it's empty of meaning because, and it like many generalizations, it's so sweeping that it overlooks the details. And the devil is in the details here. And so, what the documentary record shows is that one of the great centers of printing in Europe at that time was in Venice, Italy. And there was a firm known as the Bombergs, and the Bombergs were Gentiles despite that name. And Bomberg began printing the finest edition of the Talmud that had ever appeared in Western history with the sanction of Pope Leo X, who I've heard other people say, well, he was burning the Talmud. No, he wasn't. He was helping to get it printed. So
Indeed.
history, as we are spoon-fed it, is nothing like what the actual documentary record reveals. And so anyhow, my point is that from there, from that belt of transmission into Great Britain came Rosicrucianism. And from Rosicrucianism was spun off Freemasonry. All of these are Kabbalistic movements. Freemasonry itself is basically Kabbalism for Gentiles. If you know the Zohar, which is one of the main texts of the Kabbalah, you can see the confluences there. And it was entrenched most heavily in Great Britain. Now, this is no commentary on the English working class or the English people. They're no more in favor of this than we are here in America with all the treason that happened. This is all the rot at the top. The fish rots from the head on downward, and that's what happened. And so to this day, what appalls me is that the English nationalist movement for a renaissance in Britain, where the indigenous people of Britain, which are the whites, they're the indigenous people of Britain, can take their country back, and they associate that recovery with the British royalty, with the pomp and circumstance of the aristocracy, which has betrayed them all the way down the line. So there's something about white nationalists where they end up worshiping their executioners and failing to go into the details of history, particularly the revisionist history that I work in. And, they're not going to go anywhere as long as they're tied into this Masonic aristocracy, which is one of their worst enemies.
Yeah, and I think this is pretty much the same problem that we face here in America, right? With Trump and the whole MAGA movement. I think, whatever positive, whatever positive gains have been made, and certainly there are some, positive things we can talk about. It has been at such a horrific cost. And truly, you look at the Republican, you look at the conservative movement, as it were. Now, I no longer identify as a conservative. I've written an essay titled "The Unmaking of a Conservative," and really why, even looking back at the beginnings of this as an intellectual movement, there are many issues with it, right? And you start looking at some of the seminal conservative texts, and you see the poison pill that was there from the very beginning. And so I personally hold a very similar view with the MAGA and the Trump movement, right? Is that there is clearly, right? You look at the last 60 years of immigration policy, and this is largely what Trump made his bones about in the 2016 election, right? Was immigration policy, and how, whether it's American industry or finance or tech, that so much of it has been emptied out, been shipped off to the third world, various other countries, and how the American worker continues to lose. And now I would argue it's not just, in terms of our manufacturing, some of this other, fiscal policy, what have you. A lot of that is very built in, to the usury system and the fiat currency system. I mean, we are at the tail end here of, the 200-year cycle for fiat currency. And it is, quite disturbing, I think, frankly, looking at the response still that so many people have to being told these things about Trump, right? I have never received the amount of vitriol, the amount of invective from my audience. I mean, I could write all sorts of things, but you start talking about this man, you start talking about his very long and documented history, his ties with Zionist groups, and being bailed out by the Rothschilds. I mean, lifelong occultists. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I mean, we get, this is an episode about Trump. We'd be here, for another hour at least. But it is something about right, the Stockholm syndrome. That you have you spoke about previously. How people just fall in love with their executioners. It really is just the strangest things. I mean, you look at the conservative movement, and it has turned into an utter freak show. I mean, imagine telling your average conservative 10 years ago that the best conservative, the best Republican president of their lifetime, of all history, some might argue, would have prostitutes and transgenders speaking at the Republican National Convention,
Mhm.
giving like keynote addresses, right, to the RNC. I mean, they would be aghast. And yet I mean, that happened just, last year, right? Just last year, we had OnlyFans models, giving keynote speeches. Nicki Minaj, right? I forget the other one, but I mean, it's just absolute absurdities, right?
And yet,
And so,
at the same time, his opposition to the transgender, or actually, the name should be men who impersonate women. They used to be called female impersonators. Um, those people were something that, by Trump having a campaign against that, is what partially swept him into office more than a year ago. So it's interesting that there is that divided personality there between what they were doing at one convention and then what they knew they had to do for national appeal. It's like the same thing where they confirmed the Talmud's view of the Gentile as being having a deficient neshama, meaning soul. And you see this with the evisceration of the Palestinian people, somewhere between at least 80,000 and 150,000 civilians, probably about 30 or 40,000 children deliberately massacred, bombed with American money, American intelligence and surveillance, and American munitions and arms. And then Trump wants to be nominated for a peace prize. He says he's one of the most peaceful guys. So what this means is that Palestinian life is less than zero. If that happened to the white elite in some of the wealthy sections of America, if it happened to the Zionist elite in Jerusalem itself, this would be written in blood on the pages of history and howled up into the cosmos for our entire lifetime. It happens to Palestinians who have been labeled as subhuman by the various post-Talmudic texts. For example, Rabbi Shapira's text, The Laws of Kings, derived from Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, and others, where he has openly devalued and advocated the murder of Palestinian children, a book that gets no play here in America and is very influential in the Israeli army and in the current administration of the Israeli government. And so you're seeing that then Trump has this schizophrenia, this double mind. And the scripture tells us a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, which is a good profile of Donald Trump,
indeed.
who has done good work at the border. He has reduced immigration at the border, but at what cost? Our God is a just God, and he loves the Palestinians, about 7% of whom are Christians, as much as he loves anyone else, in my opinion. And therefore, that innocent blood speaks to him and calls out. And at the same time, can we overlook that because our border is sealed? I mean, I don't go along with that at all. There's a central evil here. But Trump strikes me as somewhat infantile, that he doesn't entirely grasp the network into which he's fallen, the Miriam Adelson money trail, which has basically bought his presidency on behalf of the Zionists and may indeed destroy the political career of Thomas Massie in Kentucky, where millions of her dollars and other Zionist dollars are going to defeat him in the forthcoming election this November, because he is, in my opinion, a true representative of what makes America great and of our American republic. And as you say, or as you implied, when Trump begins to press the buttons of his very angry and enraged mob of supporters, whether it's about Marjorie Taylor Greene, who resigned from Congress because she said her life was being threatened to such an overwhelming extent, and the same thing has happened with Massie. And that's an indicator of something very wrong with the MAGA movement, because there's a lawlessness inside of it as well. This vigilanteism. The Western United States has a heritage of vigilanteism. In Montana, Masonic secret societies called vigilante groups, and much extolled and admired even to this day in Montana, because the people don't know what was behind it, were killing their rivals and their competitors, hanging. Large majority of these victims were white. There were a few Mexicans, and maybe one or two Native Americans, I'm not certain. I don't think so, however. I think it was just a few Mexicans. Well over 100 were hanged by secret Masonic society in western Montana, whose numbers are inscribed on every state police car in Montana on the back
Mm.
fender of the car. It would be as though a southern sheriff in Mississippi had KKK written on the side of the fender, and no one thought anything of it because that's how vicious this vigilante group was. And later on, they got tied in with the Anaconda copper mine and getting rid of union organizers who wanted to give those majority white laborers a decent wage and working hours and safety and so forth. So this aspect of, like, hang them high and all these other types of things that resonates in America. And if that seeps into a society like Trump's, where people are being threatened, we can't go there. This all has to be on a legal basis. We often hear the Europeans talk about the rules-based order, which is nothing of the kind, because at the end of World War II, they allowed the communist slave masters to take over Eastern Europe. This was supposed to be a victory over Nazi Germany. Now we have communist enslavement instead of Nazi enslavement. That was their rules-based order. But the God of the Bible has set out for us a series of laws, both in the Old Testament and then based on our faith, as Jesus and Paul related it. We also have this morality that we are to adhere to. And so, no, I think it's very unfortunate to hear about these enraged people. And when you have people who are enraged, they're not thinking, they're not reasoning. They can be as manipulated as easily as cattle. And on both sides, we saw with the church invasion in Minnesota last week what happened, that atrocity. The left is enraged, the right is enraged. Well, that's not reason. And that means that through manipulation, through twilight language, through these secret societies who have practiced these black arts since the days of Pharaonic Egypt, they can come in and take over. And so, make America great again becomes a tool of the very enemies we claim we're trying to overthrow. And I see that as an occult mockery. You remember in the 18th century, there was a group called the Hellfire Club, led by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Francis Dashwood. And that was
Yes.
all about mocking the innocent and pointing out that the devil had the last laugh. At least that's what they thought. But
Hmm.
that there's a strong element of that nose thumbing in current occult rituals that we have today. And so, people can listen to our broadcast and say, well, Mr. Hoffman and Scipio, where do we go? I mean, this almost seems hopeless, but the fact of the matter is that our God is in charge of the universe. He's in charge of this. I think back to Ezekiel 14:9, where God says, and if the prophet be deceived when he hath spoken a thing, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet. And we also know from the New Testament where it says that God is the one who sends strong delusion so that people will believe a lie if they have insufficient love for the truth. But in both cases, God is in charge. The devil isn't in charge. The secret societies aren't in charge. He permits this for his own reasons, his own harsh providence in many cases. And so when we have that confidence and we know that if God is giving us these resources and he's putting this information in our hearts, and we pray that the Holy Spirit will inspire us to do the right thing, not our own will, but God's will be done, that's a tremendous source of hope for anyone raising a family or anyone who wants to look forward to the future. And it has to be done according to biblical auspices in a reasonable way. The West represents reason, not tribalism. Not this resort to violence, even though we've been very imperfectly applying that. But when people will say, well, the founding fathers, they weren't all Christians, and in fact, most of them were deists, and so forth and so on. And what I point out, and other historians have pointed out, is yes, but they were steeped in Christianity. Okay, nobody got out of third grade or whatever the equivalent was in colonial America without knowing the Bible backwards and forwards. Okay, you could preach to the members of the Continental Army from the Bible, and they would complete the sentence before the preacher got to it, even if they weren't necessarily believers. When they assaulted Fort Ticonderoga, they called out in the name of Yahweh, in the name of the great God Jehovah and the Continental Congress. And yet some of them were not necessarily believers. It wasn't a case of hypocrisy. Certainly Benjamin Franklin was no believer, but he was baptized in Samuel Willard's church. Believe it or not, Samuel Willard was the preacher who baptized him. And his parents were God-fearing Puritans. So that was the immersion of their culture. and they couldn't think outside of the Sermon on the Mount. They couldn't think outside of all of those biblical injunctions from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Whereas we today are largely biblically illiterate, and if we do know the Bible, it's a result of the manipulation of these guys on the television preachers and the rest of dispensationalism who can recite it as well as the devil did to our Lord in the desert, and yet they have none of the spirit of the scriptures. So that's not enough for me that somebody, and I'm sure it isn't for you either, that somebody recites scripture back to us. But I want
Yep.
to give that ground of hope to your listeners because so often they're left just hanging. And that's, again, a goal of the cryptocracy is to make us hopeless, to make us retreat, to make us feel that there's no point in working whatever way we do. And just in the father who works hard, comes home, takes care of his family, that's a tremendous contribution. Or you and I, who are perhaps more in front of the public eye. These are all things that extend his kingdom, the kingship of Christ. That's what we're working for.
Yeah, and certainly I think that's why I've always tried to temper my writings with, it's not just about going through history, it's not just about conspiracies, but the philosophical and theological underpinnings of how we got here, right? And as you noted, Christianity was really the milieu in which the founders, Christian or not, deist, agnostic, what have you, no matter their beliefs on it, they were all raised in these things, and so they took a lot of these benefits, right, for granted, essentially. Um, I mean, even look at the secular left now, right? You look at the humanists, and they talk about civil rights and they talk about all these other things, which, in their strictly materialist view, they can't justify whatsoever. There's like, where does a right exist? Where's human rights or abortion rights or the rest of it? Where's the material that's made up of? But it is just you know, they take many of these same things for granted, right? That we shouldn't oppress people, that we shouldn't harm or murder people. Of course, they're selective with their outrage. If it's an infant in the womb, then we have some different rules around that, right? But the outrage is selective, of course. But even then, these impulses that they have, they didn't get this from looking out at nature, right? They didn't get this from looking out at the jungle. They got this from Christianity, from growing up in the West. And so this is really, and I look back at the revolution, the American Revolution, that is, this is one of the issues that I see is that it took all these things for granted, right? So, that God has granted humanity, that he's made all humans equal, right? Well, it's like, on what basis? I look out in nature, I don't see men who are equal. I see men who are very unequal, in their abilities and their talents and their stations. But I look at the scriptures, and that's what it teaches me, right? That all humans are made in the image of God, and so we all bear, value. And I think it's, just to circle back to what you were talking about before, I I can't understand it. I try and have some sympathy because I in my more naive days was caught up in a lot of this jingoism as well. And you just don't know what you don't know, right? And so I try and have some sympathy for people, who have these positions, but it's very puzzling to me. And I on a certain level, truly cannot understand it, how someone could look at the death and the bloodshed that has been unleashed upon Gaza and be like, you know what? That's okay. But Jesus wants that actually, right? The man who said, blessed are the peacemakers, actually we should bomb them all. You know, it's quite baffling to me. It's quite baffling to me.
The people who say that Jesus wants the mass murder of the innocent are as insane as the people say that a man who's bearing the chromosomes of a male, and we don't have to use the phrase sex assigned at birth, okay? We can use the comparison of XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes. Each person bears one or the other. That's how we define male and female. It's biological reality. When that's denied, it's a sign from God that the people that you are listening to are insane. They're just completely insane and they're not worthy of a hearing. They're not worthy of leadership in any way. And the same thing goes on the right wing side for those who would see the destruction of those children, those innocent children, and have a Talmudic mentality. And this is where we are today in these extremes, which are they are enhanced and exacerbated by the technology now, which comes right into our homes. And I always advise people whenever you can to go on a fast from technology, turn the computer off for a week or a month or whatever you can do and go Amish or whatever you want to call it, so as to dry out from that. And then you can return, of course. But without that, being in a constant emotional hothouse about these things and manipulated by the various symbols and advertising slogans, then we're not proceeding along the lines that we should. And I just wanted to point out, Scipio, that one example of the Christian influence over the Bill of Rights is John Lilburn. I've been looking into Great Britain for the study on Elizabeth I and the monarchy there. And Lilburn, people have often dismissed the Puritan Revolution, which killed Charles I, the tyrant, executed him, and then created a Puritan Republic, which had many flaws, to say the least. And they'll also say, well, that was headed by Oliver Cromwell, who massacred the Irish and who did these terrible things, which is true. He did massacre the Irish, but at the same time, inside his movement, it wasn't his movement per se, it was a Puritan movement. As he attempted, for example, to re-bring the Judaic people back to Great Britain after they had been banned in 1290 by the statute of Edward I, he was rebuffed by the Puritan Parliament and the Puritan judiciary. And the right-wing mythographers don't know that. They're relying on a couple of hacks from the past who say that the Stuart dynasty was really the champion of individual liberty. Well, one of the people who was anti-Cromwell, but part of the Puritan movement at that time, was John Lilburn. And John Lilburn was called up in front of the Star Chamber and told he had to testify against himself about everything he knew about himself, his money, his finances, his activities, and he refused. And he was beaten, he was tortured, he was tormented, and he stood his ground. And as a result of that, the founding fathers looked at this example from the Puritan Revolution and created the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. If you look at the Supreme Court decision behind Miranda versus Arizona, which gave us our so-called Miranda rights, and I recommend people will read that, there's a tremendous tribute to John Lilburn. So what I say about the Puritan Revolution and other godly revolutions was, despite all their flaws, is it was an attempt to break out of the old boy network, which that monarchy had imposed, and to have fairness for the common people, the working people, and to banish corruption. If you go to the third world today, to Egypt or some of the other countries like that, and you talk to the working class people, they will say, we hate the system that we're under because we can't get ahead without bribery or having connections. And that was Great Britain before the Puritan Revolution. And the Puritan Revolution aspired, to what degree it succeeded is a matter for debate, but aspired to bring that leveling process to all the people, that you didn't need a connection, that you didn't need bribery. You had a meritocracy, which is something we hear from the right today as well. But this is what needs to be brought to the fore. Without that, when you have that corruption, which the old boy Masonic type occult secret society networks create, then the common man that God endowed with important talents to contribute is blocked out. And that's where revolutions are created. And no matter how much people want to blacken the Puritan Revolution, I salute it as far as being something that actually attempted to throw off that monarchy and create a republic there, such as the United States had or would have in the future. And it was our founders who looked to that in many ways for these types of inspiration, all of it within a Christian milieu, again, no matter how individually defective it may have been. And I think that needs to be pointed out for our listeners. And the American Revolution is so unique for the reason that you pointed out, that we are the imago Dei, that Jefferson, when he said all men are created equal, he said because we are the image-bearing creatures of God. And so every person, black, white, Judaic, non-Judaic, we all have that in ourselves. And so before the law, we are to be treated equally. It has nothing to do with employment or housing or anything like that, because that has to be based on whatever our individual characteristics. If I'm a drunken bum who's going to destroy the apartment that you rented to me, you have no reason to rent it to me. But on the other hand, when I stand in front of a jury or a judge, I must have the same rights as the rich man, the Masonic initiate, the rabbi, the imam, or whatever. That's the essence of America. And also their desire to get away from the old world wars of religion, which they really more or less did tamp down here in the United States. And that's what was tearing apart that fratricide that the cryptocracy was behind to set Protestant against Catholic and have them destroy each other and destroy their civilians and their children and say Jesus loved it, like you're quoting that fellow about Gaza. So it's been a long battle and it continues on for us. And, we'll have our rest in the grave, but until then, we've got a lot to fight for right here and now.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think looking back, I understand the impulse, and you look at the so many of the bloody wars of religion uh, throughout Christian history, Christians killing other Christians. I can understand why many of the founders, right, why a concept like freedom of religion would be promoted so heavily by them. But what I must say, I think, is that certainly in terms of worth in front of the law, yes, absolutely. But I find it quite curious, not you specifically, but when people make this kind of statement, right, that the idea that any religion should have is of equal value in the public square. I mean, that to me is a deeply unchristian idea, right? And, it's one, obviously I'm not, the Inquisition, not calling for that, right? Or that people should be going into people's homes and figure out, what they're doing. But again, it's one thing what people do in the privacy of their own home, hey, more power to you. Don't want to stop you. But what they do in the public square is a very different thing, right? And so when I look back at the revolution, the American Revolution, I truly do see this as the poison pill to so much of what would come afterwards, right? That essentially, no matter one's religious outlook or belief, that all of these should have the same exact value within the public square. I mean, that has created, as we are seeing unfold, all sorts of societal chaos. And all of the good benefits of this document were bequeathed from Christianity, but yet no recognition has been given to it, right? Of
Right,
course,
right.
Jefferson, he would give lip service to Christ, right? But I mean, you look at the treaty that America signed with the Barbary Pirates, very specifically stating that our laws are not built on our system of government is not a Christian system of government. The Muslim Barbary Pirates were accusing America of being a Christian government. Like, yes, this is a Christian nation. I mean, the vast majority of people and even the founders themselves were Christians, but the idea that the government itself was founded on Christian ideas, certainly some of them, but a Christian notion, Christian law, I really don't see that personally. I don't know your thoughts
Right.
on the matter.
I've heard some Catholic exegetes, as particular, who are very anti-Jefferson, bring that up. However, I would point out, and I'm glad that we have something to disagree on. It makes it more interesting here. I would point out that we have to we have to avoid presentism, where wars of religion here in the United States did not occur in our childhood. Presbyterians weren't hunting Catholics, papalists or popish people weren't hunting Methodists, and how free we've been of that. Generally there's been a comity between those two groups as we grew up in America, but that really wasn't the case in Europe, and you never knew when there was going to be this horrific slaughter. And this is what really motivated Jefferson, who I do believe was a sincere Christian, even though he did have that scientific materialism in terms of Jesus' miracles and things like that. So he cut them out of the New Testament that he created. But what he was doing was, and I think it's very important, was asking a question, and I'll ask it of you. Who are we going to have that establishes what type of Christianity if we did have an official theocracy here in America? Because as we know, there's what, 200 or 300 Protestant denominations? Since the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church has split into 10 or 15 different traditionalist sects, SSPX, SSPV, and so forth. Which
Yep.
one of those denominations, usually they despise the other, even though they have more in common than most anyone else would. How do they get put into charge? I mean, do we make the Presbyterians in charge? I guess Presbyterians would say yes. I mean, I think that's probably one of the goals of some of these nationalists. Or do we have Catholics would certainly like to be in charge here? And so I have to ask that question: Who, if we declare America to be Christian, and let's say that we do slightly suppress to some degree the rights of Muslims or Talmudists from running for office, say, or electioneering or something like that. Who decides those things? And also, for those who are adherents of the Arian heresy, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, do they also get suppressed? So, where do we draw the line would be my question, Scipio.
Yeah, well, I
And
think,
who draws the line?
yeah, no, these are good questions. So I think ultimately, right, what makes one a Christian is their professing and belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and that He is God of God and truly shares, in the divine nature with the Father. So, that's the argument that Jesus makes to the Pharisees throughout his disputations with them in the Gospel of John, right? That I am, right? I am the one who revealed himself to Moses, that I am Yahweh, and that if you do not believe that I am, right, in John chapter 5, then you will die in your sins. And so, you mentioned that you thought Jefferson was a Christian. I mean, certainly he professed, belief in Christ as a, moral and philosophical teacher. But, I always like to go back to C.S. Lewis's, the classic trilemma, is that Jesus really didn't just leave us the option where he is a good philosophical or moral teacher in the vein of Buddha, who also claimed to be divine, but that's beside the point. Um, he's not just this good moral teacher, right? He claimed to be not just the Son of God, but God Himself. And so that leaves us with only a couple of options here, right? Either He is truly God, as we believe Him to be, or He is a liar, or He is an insane person, right? A lunatic, that he genuinely believed some of these things, that he existed before Abraham, and the Pharisees asking him, you're not even 50 years old. How could you have seen Abraham? And Jesus, of course, answers that question. And so where's the line, right? I mean, I think Trinitarian belief is the line, right? Historically, throughout the history of the church, that's been the line, right? And, in terms of when we talk about curtailing rights, I mean, I don't, did the high places have a right? Did the worshipers of Moloch in ancient Israel have a right? Obviously, I understand. I'm not advocating we go back to the Mosaic Law, but just as a parallel here, heresy, error, and particularly, idolatry, like gross forms of idolatry. I mean, what right does it have to exist in the public square? Again, we can't police, and I don't think cannot possibly police what people, the idols that they set up in their own heart, that we can all fall prey and victim to. We will never be able to police all idols out of existence. But in terms of, allowing these, what's in North Carolina, the largest statue in America. I mean, I think the Statue of Liberty is a little bit taller because the plinth is like as tall as the statue itself on a gigantic plinth. Have you ever been there? Well, you worked in New York, so you have. But for those who have not been to New York, the plinth that the Statue of Liberty is on it is huge, right? But there is a Hindu statue that is now taller than the Statue of Liberty being set up in North Carolina. I just don't. Certainly, when the founders sold us some of these things, they could not, in their wildest dreams, maybe some of them, but for the most of them, right, could not in their wildest dreams have imagined a gigantic Hindu statue being set up in North Carolina, right? I mean, as St. Paul tells us in First Corinthians, there are truly spiritual forces behind these gods and these deities, and yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of spiritual danger, I think, by allowing and inviting some of these things into our nation.
But I think we need to trace that back to the root of the evil. And the root of the evil is not particularly with the Hindus who are proselytizing for their religion. The root of the evil is in us, that we have been so weak in terms of our money love. First of all, to be inviting these people in on immigration visas and so forth, because I'm for a very strict immigrant. I'd like to go back to what we had in the 1920s, which under Calvin Coolidge, a great president, by the way, we had these exclusions that were there, but because of the love of money, which is the root of evil in our own people, initiating this and turning a blind eye, knowing that these people are involved in this type of idolatry, that therefore, why not have them in America? After all, it's good for jobs, it's good for business. So maybe the people who should be banned are the usurers and the capitalists, and I'm for free enterprise, but I think
Yeah.
people need to look at what the word capitalism means. It translates very easily as moneyism. That's what it is. Let's call it moneyism versus socialism, and then maybe people will understand that those are two evils there, and that the central one is a Bible-based economics, which was laid out in the Old Testament and perfected by Jesus in the New. And that's where you cannot rent money, because once you rent money out at interest, at usury, you are then creating a section of your society who are the money men that we will be weeping and crying about because we live under their lash and their oppression. And yet we were the ones who instituted by refusing to follow what the Bible says about the renting of money. And once you have the money power in place, you're not going to remove it until you remove the usury system that it's based upon. And so I think that if we're taking the symptom of our own weakness, of our own degeneracy, which is that Hindu monument that you're talking about, and scapegoat them for that rather than looking at ourselves, then we get this mantle of persecution, which Christendom brought upon itself with its inquisitions and its fratricidal wars between Protestant and Catholic, and some of the injustices done, for example, not only with the enslavement of black people, and of course I wrote a book about the enslavement of whites as well, but also in terms of when we, for example, conquered Jerusalem and massacred all the children in the 11th century in Jerusalem and the civilians and so forth. So these things are not of Christ. Remember that in John, where the great debate between Catholics and Protestants about whether or not the communion wafer or host, or the as it's known, is the literal body and blood of Jesus or not. And I think there's a legitimate case for both sides to have their own opinion about it. And how that is going to be resolved is another issue. But so what happens? Some of the apostle, after Jesus said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you shall in no way have salvation. And then these people, some of his disciples, left him. What did he say? Did he say round them up as heretics? He said, let them go. Let them go. Let them decide by their own mind and their own will what is right and what is wrong according to conscience. Now, I know that can sound very naive because people can say, okay, Hoffman, we're up against a ravenous Muslim movement which will destroy us, or these militant Hindus. Well, first of all, don't generalize about Islam. It's like conflating a fundamentalist in a four-square church that used to be a gas station with a Catholic cathedral in a major city. The differences are enormous. The difference between Sunni and Shiite are enormous. Inside Sunni, the differences between the Saudi Wahhabist Salafist theology and normative Sunniism that you see practiced in Palestine, Morocco, Lebanon, and so forth are enormous. What we're really fighting is the Saudi version of Islam, the Wahhabist heresy that arose in the late 18th century, which is out to kill every Shiite, every Sufi Muslim, basically almost any Muslim that doesn't agree with them. They have never, the ISIS terrorist group has never attacked an Israeli asset. They're now embedded in Syria, thanks to Mr. Trump and his predecessors. And they're right on the border with the Israelis. And they'll kill Shiite Muslims, but they won't go across that border and fight the Israeli oppressors of the Palestinians. What does that tell us? We are
Yes, quite curious.
we're misinterpreting Islam here because of this mental laziness that we have. But to return to your point, I think it's very important that we have to understand that there has been this lust for power inside Christendom, okay, or churchianity, as I call it. And since we're all defective human beings without the grace of God, we're all susceptible to these temptations of somebody setting up a Catholic theocracy or a Presbyterian theocracy under the guise that, well, we've got a Christian government now and we're excluding Muslims and Hindus and others. And I think I stand with Jefferson on this, because what I believe is we have to have a moral rearmament of our people. We have to have a re-education and a re-ennoblement of our people, because we are capable. If the majority of Americans, white, black, or indifferent, takes on the mantle of the gospel and has a pure understanding of that, Hinduism would not have much of a place in America. Islam would not have much of a place of America. And you talked about the reconquest, and I know it was military in the Iberian Peninsula during the Spanish times and so forth. Well, there can also be a reconquest that is not violent in terms of reworking the structure of what Americans believe and what American Christians are willing to fight for. And one of those things is they can't have a rotted out base. They can't have an so-called evangelical Christian base, which is founded on the two covenant principle that there is one covenant for Israel and another covenant for Christianity. Christianity is Israel, okay? We are the Israelites. There is no others. When Paul says that all Israel will be saved, he meant all Christian Israel. All of those who convert to Christianity, they will be saved of whatever race, okay? So these are the things that if you don't have that, if you actually believe that there is some racial prestige connected with being a Khazar, because most of the people who claim to be Judaic and who are from Eastern Europe are of Khazarian descent and not of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. First of all, you're sending those people to hell on a false promise of salvation based on race. So that's anti-Judaic. That's true Jew hate. And secondly, at the same time, you're rotting out your own perceptions because you're tying yourself into a system. And not all Judaic people are of the Talmud or even of Zionism. But the point is that at its core, this covenant theology associated with so-called Israel, I call it counterfeit Israel, is inherently and intrinsically Kabbalistic and Talmudic, dishonoring of God, and indeed nullifying the scriptures of God, as Jesus said in Mark 7 and Matthew 15. So you have that rotted base. You're not going to be able to proceed from there onto renewal. And that's why this movement that we're seeing, whether it's the vestiges of the Charlie Kirk movement, what's left of it, and it seems like he was starting to go on a good path, and he was so powerful intellectually, morally, and with his repartee that he had to be killed. I have no conspiracy facts behind that, but originally I thought that Charlie was still a hardcore Zionist, and the more information that's come out, he was really questioning how his Zionist financiers were beginning to boss him around, and as an American, he didn't like the idea of that. God bless him for that. But the remnant of his movement now has retreated from many of his positions. In my opinion, maybe you have other information. And therefore, they're on this shaky ground again where they cannot proceed if they're proceeding from a government and a regime which is founded on genocide and saying that Jesus is in hell boiling in excrement. You can't, this is not the basis for a movement. Or the Kabbalah saying that, if you ever notice this, Scipio, that more and more now the notion of the Shekinah, the glory of the Shekinah, is entering Protestant exegetics. I've just had a exchange with Pastor Douglas Wilson of the Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, where he was talking about Paul. Paul refers to the glory of the Shekinah in the tabernacle.
No, he doesn't.
I said, Pastor Wilson, the Shekinah isn't mentioned in the Bible whatsoever. I thought you were sola scriptura. And if you look at the theology of the Shekinah, of what these Babylonian magi confected in terms of a goddess figure called Shekinah, and you see the type of occult detritus that's connected to her. For example, in the Zohar, it teaches that when a Jew has sex with a non-Jew, the Shekinah is harmed by that sex because it sends her down into perdition, because the Gentile woman is so filthy, so much a product of what's known as the Sitra Achra, which means utter evil with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. This is tied into the Shekinah, this goddess, and they're then connecting it to our Bible, our Word of God. Where did they get that? From this infiltration that's come through where, for example, Pastor Wilson said in his book, American Milk and Honey, 2 cheers for the Talmud. In other words, qualified support for the Talmud, which he's now become more notorious for, because at a recent meeting this winter, he talked about the gold that there is in the Talmud. And what I'm trying, I challenged him to debate, and he hasn't taken the challenge up thus far.
You know, weird. I'd also challenged him to debate, and he didn't respond to me either.
Yeah, he told me I have too small a platform. But what I tried to point out to him is that even a broken clock is correct twice a day. So if he's finding gold in the Talmud, what would we say, for example, for someone who got up on stage and said that he found gold in Mein Kampf? okay? And that Hitler was a really bad guy and he can only give two cheers to the Mein Kampf. Well, people would say you're a neo-Nazi. Why would you have to rehabilitate Adolf Hitler? And we can talk about this in another show sometime. I wrote a book called Adolf Hitler, Enemy of
I
the
would
Jews.
love to. Yes, indeed.
And so why would you do that? Because it's an obvious attempt to lift the status of Mein Kampf up to something that has some good in it, and we should study it, okay? And at the same time, when you talk about the Talmud, and I know he hasn't done this with the Kabbalah, but also some others have done it, you're going to bring those aspects which have an evil spirit connected to them into your movement. And this is what's happened with this glory of the Shekinah concept. I was looking at John MacArthur's writings. He has a huge commentary on the Bible, and I've respected
Yeah.
him for the stand he took against the COVID lockdowns, and I've enjoyed some of his commentary. Lo and behold, while he was disrespecting the Blessed Virgin Mary and saying that Catholics give her undue reverence, and I know there are probably some extremists who do that, Mariolatry as it's known, but she certainly deserves the highest praise. Even Martin Luther said she was above all women, and of course, the angel Gabriel said that to her. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou above all women. And
Yep.
so what you have here is you see where they're going with this Shekinah is replacing Mary and taking over in here because of this infiltration factor. So, Pastor Wilson, do you really want to hold the Talmud up as containing some gold when you see, for example, John MacArthur doing the same thing in his commentary? In one section, he's going after undue reverence for Mary. At the same time, he's lifting up the Shekinah. What? This is a double-minded man,
It
unstable.
is quite
So,
baffling.
yeah, we have
Yeah,
to
I
we
mean,
have to point these things out.
unfortunately, it's not just modern Protestant exegetes either. I was reading Matthew Henry several months back, or I guess it was last year, late last year, and I saw him use the term Shekinah. I was like, oh, Matthew, why? I mean, I tremendously respect, Matthew Henry's works and his commentaries, and I mean, even some of the greatest exegetes, of all Christian history. I mean, they just take these things up. Hey, it sounds, Judaic. It must be in there somewhere, I guess, but it is nowhere. And as you correctly, pointed out, and as I've noted in my writings as well, I mean, this is right. This is part of the divine aspect of the Godhead, so called, and a major aspect of Kabbalah is, essentially sex magic, right? And so much
Yeah.
of the emphasis on sex magic in the occult is not, their own invention, but is something that, and I mean, we can trace this back, and many of the occultists will admit this freely, right? That this knowledge goes back to ancient Egypt, and truly is the fount of so much of the magical knowledge, that we know of, right? I mean, the rabbi said, rather famously, when that Egypt got 9/10 of all of the magic that was doled out to the nations. And so, the magical knowledge and wisdom of the Egyptians is, I mean, yeah, exceeds all other nations. And so, no matter the occult tradition, the reason why, you see so much of the symbolism and this imagery, whether it's in, the Church of Satan or Freemasonry or what have you, I mean, I mean, Kabbalah itself all goes back, to Egypt.
No, absolutely. And yet they're trafficking with this. And yes, Matthew Henry and these others, I think largely through naivete that they had about what they considered the wonder working magic of the Hebrew language, for example, and they associated sort of a prestige if you're pronouncing these words and bringing them in. But I think now it's a more sinister thing because the counterfeit Israel hadn't been established in the Middle East, and we've seen the fruits of it now. We've seen the fruits of the weaponization of the Talmud by Zionism. And we don't have the time today to go into what the Talmud was like before Zionism, but afterwards it was weaponized. And so the ferocious racism and the ferocious advocacy of violence against those who are not part of the Talmudic chosen has now been exacerbated to the extent that we've seen not only with what happened beginning in October of 2023, this goes all the way back to 1948 and before that, the slaughter
Oh,
and
yes.
dispossession of the Palestinians. So with that in mind, that someone is then trafficking with this and associating it with the gospel of Christ, especially with all the resources, intellectual and otherwise, that Douglas Wilson would have for correcting himself on this issue. He doesn't have to resort to Scipio or Michael Hoffman in order to
Nope.
find out the error of his ways. And I think that we have to continue to struggle as much as we can. There are tremendous forces allied against us, but if this is what God wants, then I have no fear. In fact, I'm very grateful to be able to be part of this and make some type of contribution, because I do believe that we're on the horizon. We're very close to having a breakthrough here, because people, when they see these false gods, whether it's Donald Trump or others, and I hate to see Pastor Wilson wander off in this way, because he's done some great work with the classical Christian academies as a counselor, a marriage counselor. He's an interesting fellow in many ways. I've been in his study in Moscow. We corresponded before the break that we had here over his book, American Milk and Honey. I hate to see this, but at the same time, there has to be a cleavage here, because we need to break through. My heart goes out to the Palestinians who are being starved and killed even right now under the guise,
Yep.
this was January 2026, under the guise of a ceasefire, but because they
Getting
have no
bombed almost every
value.
day.
They have no value in the eyes of the corporate media of the United States. Their deaths don't register. 20 people can die in a plane crash or train accident, and it's on the news for 3 or 4 or 5 days, rightly so, fine. But children are being shot in the head deliberately, repeatedly, over and over again. In Palestine, it's business as usual. So that type of corruption rots everything here. And it's a cri de coeur for me. It's a cry to my heart that we would reach out. And people can say, well, why is that a special cause for you? Things are happening like that in Burma and Africa and so forth. Well, because we, the American taxpayers, are funding that massacre. That's what makes it different, okay?
Bingo.
Donald Trump and every preceding president, believe it or not, Jimmy Carter was one of the first ones to try and throw a monkey wrench into it. And of course, the one who sacrificed his life trying to actually obstruct it was John F. Kennedy Jr., in terms of trying to keep nukes out of the hands of the Israelis, which is one of the reasons, but not the sole reason, that he was killed. And so these are the big topics that I enjoy talking with informed people like you, Scipio, and I appreciate the opportunity to reach your audience here today. I think we've gone about a half hour over what we were supposed to, but it's been pretty.
Just a little bit.
I'm glad to have done it, and I thank you very much for having me today.
No, yes, Mr. Hoffman, I appreciate your wisdom in terms of, parapolitics and occult research. You would be hard pressed to find more erudite, more well-researched books than yours. Yeah, I mean, there's so many topics that we touched upon today that truly could be episodes in their own right. When you were speaking of usury and turning the lens back upon us. I mean, there's no disagreement from me there, brother, right? It's the problem is us, and we have the exact amount of evil that we are willing to tolerate. And so as long as we're willing to tolerate evil, then we will continue to be cursed with it. And so Mr. Hoffman, deeply appreciate your time today. Where can people, again, find your work? You're on Substack at Revelation of the Method, and then your website, revisionisthistory.org. Are there any other platforms that people can find your work? What's the best place to get some of your written works?
michaelhoffman.substack.com, very easy address, or revisionisthistory.org. And from there, you can see that I have a blog on the Talmud. I have a podcast, Michael Hoffman's Revisionist History. There's lots of resources at the website, and also my 3 times a month, roughly, studies that I issue through Substack are also available there as well.
Yeah, but I can't recommend those books. Usury in Christendom has to be one of my favorite books I've ever read on the subject of tax and economic policy. Just actually, before I let you go, I was just curious. I didn't have a chance to work it in, but did you grow up Catholic? Are you still
Yes.
Catholic? I mean, you have a tremendous grasp of church history. So I would have been very surprised if you were a Protestant.
So I'm a
No offense to
Catholic.
any of my Protestant listeners out there.
Well, very briefly, my grandmother is Scotch-Irish. My grandmother Hoffman, she's long deceased now, but she was living in a kind of ramshackle cottage outside of Schenectady, New York. And her eldest child, Mary, my Aunt Mary, was dying of pneumonia. And the doctor had been there and given up hope. There was no penicillin in those days. And so a knock on the door came in the midst of swirling snow and icy conditions. And there was a monk there named Brother Andre who knocked on the door. He's fairly famous in French Canada, coming out of Montreal, I believe. And he was a peripatetic monk. He wandered around the area and he said, "Is there anything that you need? I'm here to help out. I am a Catholic friar, but if you don't object to that, is there something I can help you with?" And she said, "Well, no, sir." She said, "My daughter's dying here. I have to or administer to her." And he said, "Oh, well, can I come in and pray over her?" And he not only prayed over her, he laid hands on Aunt Mary, and Aunt Mary revived. She lived into her 50s. And my grandmother said, "What can I do? Well, how can I repay you?" And he said, "Promise me that you'll raise this child and all the other children that you have Catholic." And she was so thunderstruck by what happened. She did that. So all of my father and his brothers and sisters, there were five of them, were all raised Catholic. Now, he didn't make her promise to go to Catholic church, so she didn't. But she put him in Catholic school. And two of my uncles, Uncle David and Uncle Joe, became Protestant ministers, evangelical Protestant ministers who went door to door on their own. And when I talked to Uncle David one time, he's a great guy, a veteran, American veteran, a hero in many ways. And I said, "Well, you were raised Catholic." And he said, without any of that vitriol between Protestants and Catholics, he said, "Yes. And it was the nuns who first gave me my love of Scripture and the Bible." It was a wonderful ecumenical concept, and he really meant it. And so my German American father, with a Scottish Irish side to him, uh, uh, married my mother, Italian American Roman Catholic. And the marriage didn't last as long as it should have. My father was sort of a free spirit and went off like his brothers into other things. But I was raised Catholic among, I would say, a different type of, under the pontificate of John the 23rd. Well, actually born during the pontificate of Pius the 12th. I was an altar boy. But it was a different milieu intellectually and spiritually than what you see among many traditional and so-called conservative Catholics today. It was much more open to a freedom of mind and a willing to have disputations with others, even if they're not of like mind. I think a lot of that is the influence of the Irish, who were largely our priests here in America and in the hierarchy, because the Irish had never really persecuted anybody. The Irish never had colonies. They were persecuted by the British Empire. And so we had a type of Irish priest and Irish nun, some of them fairly formidable in terms of discipline and things like that, but who gave us an opening in terms of intellectual horizons. And so that's what I pursued. My mother was the same way, with her capacity for Latin and delving into the treasures of the church. But then as I began to look into the corruption which took the church over during the Renaissance, many Catholics think that it all started with Vatican II, and those who have a little bit more knowledge believe it started with the Enlightenment, particularly the French Enlightenment, or the overthrow of the Bourbon dynasty in France in the 18th century. And that's where I started looking into it and finding that no, it was much older than that. And the antecedents are all the way back, as we said at the top of the broadcast, in the 15th century. And so I'm walking a fine line between the infiltration of the church by this Kabbalism, which extended all the way up to the eminence grisée behind the Second Vatican Council, which was Henri Lubac, a Jesuit, who was an exponent of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's Kabbalism. In fact, he wrote a laudatory biography about him and promoted this Kabbalism inside the church. When John Paul II, who was raised to sainthood, I don't know why, but he was raised to sainthood by the cryptocracy inside the church. Before that, when he was Pope, he made Lubac a cardinal. And people can say, yes, but conservatives prior to that had kept Lubac, they had suppressed him and so forth. Well, a lot of that is for show, or a lot of it is for managing what timetable we have in terms of indoctrinating Catholic people and what they're ready to receive and accept and hear. And so what I believe is that there's an eternal root to the Catholic Church. I also believe it's in Greek and Russian Orthodoxy, and that there is a rootedness to the scriptures, and that it's not a case of like, oh, well, it's scripture and tradition, and the traditions are allowed to nullify the church. No, we need to look at the Catholic Church as it existed in the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th centuries, when many Protestant exegetes were looking to read Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Anselm, Thomas of Aquinas, and quote them and delve into them. And then later on, we have a departure from that biblical root beginning in the Renaissance. But I still see, in my opinion, the hand of God on the church in terms of an indefectibility as it relates to the person in the pew. And I remember growing up as a Catholic kid, surrounded by Irish and Italian people in my section in New York there, and seeing the vast majority of them, even though you had the hoodlums and the gamblers and the adulterers like anywhere else, the vast majority of them were just kind and decent people, which is what I found. And, by their fruits ye shall know them. And so this might not be the most coherent apologia for my views, but what I'm suggesting is that there's some kind of a link between me and the church. And I don't know where my position is in the schema, but it is to try and have a real reformation of the church to return it to pre-Renaissance times, although there were some bright spots, including the Council of Trent, which I know, many Protestants have an issue with. But one of the things about the Council of Trent, if you read the Catechism of the Council of Trent, it forbids the renting of money. And I think you may have remembered that from my book on usury in Christendom. And so that was a tremendous thing. It was a tremendous to restate Christ's own view in Luke chapter 6, I believe, where he says, lend expecting nothing in return. And people try to mitigate that, and use Talmudic type tactics to try and distill it into something that it is not, because it's forthright, it's clear. And he said, even wicked people will lend to others. You are to be the highest and the best. You lend without expecting anything in return. That's really the basis of the Western economy and of the Western church, when the church returns to that. So I'm always open to the idea. Now, at the same time, I'm very controversial among fellow Catholics because I find much to admire in Martin Luther. Martin Luther was doing his best to stay inside the church, and the church, under those papalists in the 16th century, were driving him out with the selling of indulgences, which was administered by the Fugger banking dynasty of usurers, with the selling pieces off the cross of Calvary, and there were enough pieces of the cross of Calvary to fill a lumber yard, and making money off of that. And also taking statues, which are supposed to be a memorial to remind Catholics of what the spirit behind that is. When you see the crucified Jesus on the cross, you're not there to worship that cross. It's just a piece of wood. It's a piece of silver on it. But that he shed his blood for us, and what that really meant. For some people, that means a lot. I know of an Amish lady whose son was in a hospital. He had actually gone through a threshing machine. He was in terrible, horrible shape. And she said, is there a chapel where I can pray? And it was a Lutheran hospital, and there was a giant crucifix with Christ on. She said it uplifted her, it ennobled her. So we have to be careful when we talk about idolatry, statues, and so forth. There were two golden cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant, okay? It depends on what we do with these things. And so for Luther, he was trying to say, my dear beloved church, you have to turn away from these things. He was trying to make an appeal to the Pope, and he was pushed away. And I've often thought that Charles V, the emperor that saw the disputation where he rose up and said, here I stand, I can do no other, actually became a crypto-Lutheran during his time. I wrote a study on that. Luther was always very fond of Charles V, in spite of the fact that he was the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. So there's a lot to this story. Now, I think Luther went off the rails with his vituperation against the Talmud is such that it's excessive. And talking about burning down synagogues and things like that is, beyond the pale. But the core of his belief that there was something inherently wrong with the Talmud was something that would then lead to Lutherans being vigilant on this subject, much more so than other denominations. And that led to, in 1700, the magnificent research of the Heidelberg professor of Oriental languages, Johann Eisenmenger, who wrote a book called Endectus Judentum, Judaism Discovered, which I also named my book after, a 2002-volume book. He had spent 20 years working with rabbis in Amsterdam, learning all of their ways, all of the texts. He mastered Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, and that's the product of his research there as a Lutheran. And it's a marvelous book. He didn't buy into all of the ritual murder claims that people had made about Judaic people. And it's a very well-documented scientific book. What happened? The Holy Roman Emperor had financiers inside his administration, and they said, you can't allow this book to circulate. And so out of obeisance to them, he pulled the book. He had it destroyed. Almost all copies in 1700 were destroyed. Eisenmenger's life's work. Eisenmenger died shortly afterwards of a broken heart. He was so dispirited. And that book really faded into history. It was reprinted in Prussia around 1714, but it didn't have the impact, for example, of something like the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is a very flimsy and disputed text. I don't want to argue the merits or demerits. That could go on forever. It's like, who really wrote?
It's probably fake, but yeah, exactly.
But
it's a whole thing.
why would you choose, why would someone like Hitler choose, he was the, Chancellor of Germany with all that power of the printing press and the money. Why would he choose to promote a disputed text like the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion when Eisenmenger's book, and he could have asked fellow researchers in Germany if he wasn't aware of it personally, that was the shining example of an enormous monumental refutation of the Talmudic rabbinic gnosis, and it's completely avoided. I see a conspiracy right there. If they had printed thousands of copies of Endectus Judentum and translated it into several languages, French, English, and Spanish, that would have made a world of difference, and instead it didn't. But that was to me the Lutheran heritage, that Eisenmenger had been inspired by Luther's defiance. Luther was tremendously courageous. And it's interesting that Wilson recently, Pastor Douglas Wilson, who we've been talking about, tried to call on Calvin as being somebody who had some type of affinity for the same revisionism that Wilson is showing towards the Talmud. I can't find anything in Calvin whatsoever that's complementary toward the Talmud or the rabbinic world whatsoever. And in fact, the quote that Doug furnished for his example was actually quite ferociously opposed to what we're talking about here. So, Calvin's supposed to be, a tremendous enemy of the Catholic Church, but at the same time, I can see first of all, of course, he was influenced in his economics by Catholic nominalists, and that's where he went off on, justifying some aspects of usury, although not in Geneva, and he was personally opposed to it. But at the same time, he fell under the influence after, and he's not the progenitor of this, that's a myth, after the Catholic nominalists pushed through, beginning with Leo X again, who was the Medici Pope. There would be two Medici pontiffs, Clement VII later on in the 1520s and Leo. And so in May of 1515, he begins the gradual process. This is always gradual, incrementally instituted. It would culminate in the 1830s under another pope who would then fully release Catholic confessors and confession. If a usurer came to them and said, I've been renting out this money and I want to be forgiven, I'm going to stop doing it because I want to be able to receive communion. They no longer had to forbid it. So in that long peregrination there from Leo up to the pontiff in the 19th century, you can see this incremental process that was used, and they initiated it, and then Calvin went along with it. But so there, and the Wesleys inside Methodism had a heart for God. And I think that the better Catholic scholars take the position that I take in terms of seeking what there is that we can find in common. And as you were talking about when you mentioned Trinitarianism, Protestants typically, Catholics call it the Holy Trinity. My Protestant friends call it the Triune God. But we meet on that common ground. And I've heard Protestant ministers talk about, the Catholic Church was always faithful to Trinitarianism, which was a nice thing to say. So let's find what we have in common and what unites us without any of us shedding our integrity for what we believe, because I'm not for the phony ecumenism, which is exactly what Pico della Mirandola was claiming in this particular Prisca Theologia, as it's called. The concept is that at one time all religions are from one root, and this goes back to the Pharaonic Egypt that you and I have been talking about. And so from that one root sprang Hinduism and Buddhism and Catholicism, and which is patently wrong and absurd on its face, but that's what's behind this false ecumenism. But that shouldn't block us from trying to seek what there is that we can share and break bread together about. And so, insofar as traditional Catholics, some of them want to get sort of like another Inquisition going. I can't take part in that whatsoever. I have to just walk this fine line. And where I am in my own piety and practice of Christianity is just like what you were saying, what you do in your own home. But certainly, yes, I consider myself a Catholic. There's no question about it. And I'm very, very fortunate that I was raised in that heritage, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you once again. I could sit here and listen all day, but I'm sure you have things to get to, and I already appreciate you. You've been very generous with your time. So, yeah, folks, you can find Michael Hoffman's work at revisionisthistory.org or Revelation of the Method at Substack. That's michaelhoffman.substack.com. And if you enjoy my work whatsoever, I owe a tremendous amount, a debt of gratitude, truly, to Mr. Hoffman. And, we are just so many researchers, right, are just standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. So, Mr. Hoffman, thank you once again, and look forward to bringing you back in the future.